Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Good Roads Podcast. I am Jared LeMay, here with a man who is described around the Good Roads office as a young Jimmy Kimmel, Thomas Barakat. The weather can't seem to make up its mind lately, right, Thomas? I guess our next guest is pretty topical then?
Yeah, that's right, Jared. First of all, I don't think I've heard anyone refer to me as a young Jimmy Kimmel, but I'll try to fill that role in this podcast. This weather has been pretty crazy, but it's also pretty typical for Canadian spring. It kind of gives you that false hope early on that we're actually there, and then it kind of reverts back to winter, having more winter weather than it was during winter. So, let's talk about weather, but let's talk about climate today. That's more.
Yeah, and on today's episode, we're jumping out of the proverbial frying pan and into the global fire, climate change, that is. And if you're listening on Spotify, check out the poll in the app and let us know what you think of climate change before we discuss it with our next guest. I'd like to hear what everybody else says about it and if we maybe can change some minds or something like that. So today we have with us the second keynote for this year's Good Roads Conference. She is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy with a degree in atmospheric science and an unbelievable amount of peer-reviewed papers, abstracts, and other publications, and many key reports, including the U.S. Global Change Research Program's Second National Climate Assessment. She also has a TED Talk, which I'll link in the description below. She's been on Jimmy Kimmel, which I'll link in the description below, and has a book that untangles the complex science and tackles many long-held misconceptions about global warming. Katharine Hayhoe, welcome to the Good Roads Podcast. When we're all done, you'll have to let us know if our Jimmy Kimmel is as good as the one that you met.
I will. And I was going to say, Thomas, I think they call you that behind your back. That's the point.
Anyway, to dive in, let's start things off very simply. Why don't you give us a little heads up, a little discussion about yourself, what you do, and I guess a little primer before we get into the conference in the end of April.
Sure. So first of all, I'm Canadian. I'm from Toronto. And I grew up with a dad who was a science teacher. In fact, my dad actually ended up as the science coordinator for the Toronto Board of Ed. So I grew up with the idea that science was the funnest and coolest thing you could possibly study. I was indoctrinated from a very early age and ended up studying physics and astronomy at U of T.
Nice.
And I still love the idea that using nothing more than things that we can build on this, relatively insignificant planet in the scale of the universe, we can actually uncover the far ranges of the universe and how it began and what's happening to galaxies that are, millions of billions of light years away. I mean, it's just incredible what you think of what astronomy can do. So how did I end up as a climate scientist? Well, I was almost finished my undergrad degree and I needed one more breadth requirement. And I'd already done children's literature and I'd already done, all the breadth requirements people take. And I looked around and there's this brand new class on climate change over in the geography department. And I thought, well, that looks interesting. Why not take it? So I had learned about deforestation and air pollution and climate change in my geography classes. We all know that David Suzuki cares passionately about this issue and is going to help fix it. And so my perspective is, support his work, watch his documentaries. And, we've got Sir David Attenborough these days too. Right. And they're going to take care of these environmental issues. But when I took this class, I was really surprised to learn that, first of all, climate change is already happening now. It's not a future issue anymore. And this was back when I was a student. It was already happening now. And then I was also surprised to learn that climate modeling, which is what I do now, is all physics. I don't know what I thought it was, but I didn't realize it was just the same physics. But what really changed my perspective is when I learned that climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us equally. It is an environmental issue, but it's also a health issue. It's a poverty issue. It's a food issue. It's an equity issue. It's an economic issue. It's even a national security issue. And so to care about climate change, we don't have to be David Suzuki or Sir David Attenborough. We just have to be a human being living on this planet. And unfortunately, the people who are most affected are the people who have contributed least to the problem and who have the least means to fix it. And that's just not fair. And so realizing that and realizing that I sort of serendipitously had the skill set you need to study this issue, that's what made me decide I need to do what I can to help fix this problem too. And back then I optimistically thought, well, surely it's so important and so urgent, we'll fix it soon. And I'll just go back to studying galaxies. At this point, I don't think I would. I think I'd probably just, open like a local yarn store on Vancouver Island if I could retire. But thankfully, we are a lot further along on fixing this issue than we were when I started. We just need more.
Interesting. Wow. That's quite the journey, I got to say, from stars and galaxies to our own planet. You mentioned there a couple of things, like the inequity. I guess for a lot of our listeners, we're municipal based, and that's going to affect us one way. I guess what down the line does this look like for municipalities and uh, I guess trying to deal with our infrastructure and the changing climate. If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I do, because cities are actually one of the organizations I work with the most.
Huh.
And that is because climate change is a global issue, but it's affecting us locally. And rather than referring to it as global warming, as so many people do, I usually prefer to call it global weirding, because wherever we live, things are getting weird.
Oh yeah, seriously, this has been a weird winter.
Oh yeah, so this winter in Toronto was the first winter that we've ever had in recorded history where the average temperature was above zero.
Huh.
Above
Really?
zero in
Wow.
Toronto. I mean, I remember if you grew up in the area, you probably did too. I remember massive amounts of snow and like not even being able to get the car out of the driveway.
Military coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong, it's still winter. You still get snow, you still get cold, but on average, it's getting warmer, and we can see it affecting us locally. So one of the biggest ways that we see climate change affecting us is by taking our naturally occurring extremes, because we always have floods and droughts and heat waves and wildfires, even taking our naturally occurring extremes and supersizing them, making them worse. So we've always had wildfires, but we've never had a wildfire season like last year.
Right.
I mean, I don't remember a time when I was young with wildfire smoke choking the air and turning the sky orange. And I live in Texas now, where we just had the biggest wildfire on record in Texas in January and February in Texas.
Wow.
And, I grew up in a house where we didn't have air conditioning, right? I mean, the 1 week a year when it was too hot, everybody sleeps down the basement. Well, now you have to have air conditioning. It's standard.
Yeah.
Everybody has it. Flooding risk is increasing. Our permafrost up north is thawing. People who live on the coastlines are worried. Look at what's been happening in Vancouver with the massive floods that they've been having, the wildfires, the extreme heat waves. Cities are really at the forefront of getting hit by these impacts, because so much of our infrastructure is designed for a planet that doesn't exist anymore. But cities also have so much power to affect change within their boundaries. And cities often are where people come together, because regardless of our politics, if we all live in a city, we all want it to be a safe place for us to live. We all want to be able to get around to work. We don't want our insurance rates to skyrocket. We want our kids to be able to play outside. And so cities are a place where we can come together often in ways that at the national level, it's a little harder, because we're so much more politically polarized at that level. So I've worked with all kinds of cities, helping them look ahead to see what's coming, and then prepare everything from their public health system to the amount of energy that they're going to be using in the public school system to their water systems, all of that preparing so that when these changes come, we will be able to adapt, and we can even affect our local climate. So I was working with the city of Chicago, which is very similar to Toronto, actually, on a big lake, in the mid latitudes. Just rotate Toronto 90 degrees and you got Chicago. And they've had some really severe heat waves. In fact, they had them back in the 90s. So we looked at how you could, through reflective surfaces and green roofs, you could lower the temperature of Chicago by 2 or 3 degrees, enough to offset how much global warming was increasing its temperature over the next couple of decades. Cities are just amazing what they can do to make a difference.
Is that where that giant bean came from?
I don't know about the bean. What is that?
Oh, they have this giant metallic bean. It's just shiny, and I figured you reflect sunlight with that.
I know what that is. It's not big enough. You need more. Yeah.
I guess I'm not as funny as Jimmy Kimmel.
Oh no, you're getting there. So cities I think are awesome. And just to give you an anecdote, I was at the National Conference of Mayors in the US a couple of years ago, and I was talking to, they have a climate committee and an environment committee, and I was talking to them about what cities can do and how you can invest in nature-based solutions and green infrastructure and clean energy to clean up your air and keep the heat down and save money and help with climate change too. How you can especially green low-income neighborhoods that can be they can be 5 to 7 degrees Celsius hotter in low-income neighborhoods because they don't have green cover than in high-income
Right.
neighborhoods in the same city. And so by addressing these issues, we can address equity issues, we can address health issues, we can clean up the air because, of course, vegetation filters the air, provide places for water to go during floods, make it cooler during heat waves, and improve people's physical and mental health, because spending time outdoors in green space actually affects our body chemistry. So I was talking to the mayors about this, and at the end, this one mayor came marching up to me and he said, "I'm a Republican." Yeah. When you're a climate scientist in the States and someone marches up to you and says that, at that point, you're usually wondering whether you need to run or not. but just to be clear, I want to talk to Republicans about climate change, because a hurricane, a wildfire, a heat wave does not care how you vote. It affects us all equally.
Right.
He said, "I'm Republican, and of course I care about climate change because it's affecting all of us. We need solutions that work for people where they live." I was like, "Can you please run for president?"
So, Katharine, you mentioned a lot of the work that cities, local governments are doing and the potential that they have to even kind of do more. Are they moving quick enough on this? And are like maybe other levels of government as well? Are we moving kind of as a society here? Are we moving quick enough on climate change, or is it too slow? And then the remedy later is going to have to be more kind of extreme in a way because we didn't start or move quickly enough at an earlier time?
The answer is largely no. So we are already on the pathway to cutting our carbon pollution, taking steps to reduce our future impact, and building resilience and adapting to the changes that we can't avoid anymore. But we're not doing enough. So in Canada, we're actually a few years behind the US in terms of assessing where we are at with this.
Yeah.
So in Canada, we just had our first big national adaptation report come out a couple of years ago. It's a really great resource. We have a whole series of national reports on how climate change is affecting Canada and then what we can do to adapt. And that report focused very much on how, and I'll be talking about that during my talk at the conference, about how we have to focus on our infrastructure. A lot of our infrastructure is just not really prepared for what's happening.
All right.
A lot of our financial systems aren't either. But in the States, we've had a national climate assessment in the States since 2000. And I've been an author on the second, third, fourth, and fifth one. So I've been in there for a while. And in the fifth one that just came out last November, they actually surveyed all the states across the country and they tracked which cities had climate adaptation plans. And what they found is every state, and most of the biggest cities in every state, have climate adaptation plans, but they're still not ambitious or aggressive or, of enough magnitude to really address the problem. So the answer is generally no. But this year, I was actually at the World Economic Forum for the first time. I'd never been to that before in my life, but I went this year because I'm part of this Earth Decides community that's about really trying to help people understand that every decision is a climate decision, whether you're in infrastructure or finance or the public sector. And I hosted a panel where we had the head of the United Nations Environmental the United Nations Environmental Program, and she said, "No, we're not adapting fast enough." We had an economist, and she said, "No, we're not adapting fast enough." And then we had the head of Swiss Re, who is one of the big reinsurance companies that goes behind all the insurance companies like Allstate that we get home insurance from. And so I asked him, "Are we adapting fast enough?" He said, "Well, in my industry, we are." I said, "Oh, tell me more." And he said, "Well, we just price insurance year by year. So if we have to increase the price, we just increase the price. And if we can't afford to offer insurance in a certain location, we pull out."
Yeah.
Right.
So in Florida and Louisiana and some parts of California, they're already pulling out. And I have a colleague in Florida. I told her this just last week. And she's like, "Well, yeah, my home insurance went from $2,000 US a year to $5,000 US a year in 1 year." So the insurance industry is adapting, but ironically, their adaptation is putting all of us even more at risk.
Right. Yeah, we've had similar experiences here on the insurance front. I live in a condo, and I remember they said, I asked, why are fees going up so much? And they're like, "Well, because insurance has gone up like crazy on condos." And they're like, "But by the way, you're lucky because some condos out west, they're not even insuring them anymore." We're like, "Oh, wow. I'm so lucky to be paying double the amount I paid the year before."
Exactly. And so I feel like there's and actually I am quite sure there is a potential housing crisis looming. Because, if you get a mortgage, you have to have insurance, right? Well, what if you can't get insurance? You can't get the mortgage.
That's true.
Well, that's what I've heard a lot about Florida too, is that like you've got to make sure that land is insurable before you even build on it.
Exactly. Because
Yeah.
who can afford to buy a house without getting a mortgage? Well, only the very richest people can afford to. And so what that's doing is it's creating even more inequity than we already have.
Yeah.
Right. Huh. So Catherine, what is then on that note, what's the biggest impediment to us acting quicker on this? So it's like we know this is all, the future doesn't look good. We already have a housing crisis, might get even worse. If I'm at the various level of governments, I see this, but what's stopping the governments and people? Is it the people aren't demanding it enough from the governments so that they're not acting quick enough, or what have you seen?
I think there's two major issues going on. And I think of them actually, I'm a very visual thinker. I think of them as we haven't really connected our head to our heart yet, and we haven't connected our heart to our hands. So up here, most of us know this thing is real. It's serious. Oh my gosh, the headlines are so bad, I don't even want to read them anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I even feel that way. And I'm a climate scientist. But we still haven't really fully connected the dots to my house, my job, my family, my city, my budget, my current issues. We're sort of like frogs in a pot of boiling water, where it's just gotten to the point where we're starting to look around. We're like, oh, it's a little warm in here. I wonder why. That's where we're at right now. But the time to jump out is before it boils. It's not, you can't, once it boils, too late. So that's problem number one, is it just takes a while for these things to sink in because there's so much noise in our public lives. And so much of the information that we see in the media on climate change is not about my neighborhood in Calgary or Halifax or Vancouver. Most of it's about, the polar bears or people who live far away or what's happening in the ocean. And so we just haven't really connected the dots to what's happening right here. That's problem number one. The second problem, though, is that these changes are happening faster than any time in human history. We have never seen changes happening this fast. In fact, for most of human civilization, which is 6 to 8,000 years, climate has been incredibly stable. And so our whole human systems, all of them, our water, our food, our infrastructure, they're all designed on the past. It's as if we've been driving down the road, looking in the rear view mirror for decades and centuries. I mean, our building codes are based on past climate. Where we grow our food, based on past climate. How we allocate our water, based on past climate. But if the road is straight, if climate isn't changing very quickly, which over most of human civilization, it was very stable, then we can stay on the road looking in the rearview mirror. And so the entire paradigm of our society, our decision-making is based on looking in the rearview mirror. But if we hit a curve, and we are hitting a curve, our wheels are on the rumble strip right now, we have to look ahead down the road, and none of our systems are built to do that. I work with, for 10 years, I've worked with construction and infrastructure engineers who do transportation infrastructure. And it took us, first of all, a year just to figure out that when an engineer says conservative and a climate scientist says conservative, we mean something completely different. An engineer means worst case scenario times 4. Or if they're very conservative, worst case scenario times 10. And that's what they build the bridge for.
Right.
A climate scientist conservative is not so bad. It won't be so bad. Low end scenario, totally opposite end. And I think the engineers are right. If human safety is at stake, which it is, we should be going the opposite way.
Yeah.
Right.
So then I said, well, why aren't you looking ahead down the road? Why are you still building massive amounts, trillions of dollars of infrastructure around the world, looking in the rearview mirror? So one engineer called Alice, I'll never forget, she said, I will show you why. And she came in the next day and she had a 3-ring binder that was so big, I don't even know where she would get it. I've never seen a 3-ring binder that was more than a foot tall. I didn't even know they made them. And she was like struggling to carry this thing in. And she slams it on the desk just because it weighs so much. She drops it on the desk and the desk shook. And she said, how much of this do you think are the climatic conditions that we have to account for when building a bridge? I said, well, I don't know. She said, 3 pages at the end.
Wow.
Huh.
That is how standardized this has become. And this is why it's so hard for us to change, is because it is hardwired into every part of our system. So we have to think creatively. We have to think outside the box. We have to be willing to change. And we have to understand why it matters to me now and here. Those are the things we're missing.
So talking about that, and even going back to point one, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think a lot of people are thinking more currently than in the future, because there are a lot of problems going on right now, which may tie into climate change. But you look at the housing crisis now in Canada, and people are trying to figure out how to pay their mortgages. They need a job, and there's no jobs. Like, you see lineups of people. They're thinking about that as opposed to, okay, now I've got to pay another 4 times on a carbon tax, and in 3 years I've got to get rid of my car and get an EV. I can't afford any of that. People are thinking short term, not long term. I guess, how do you tell people that, I guess, to hell with the short term, we've got to think long term,
Oh, yeah.
especially if they don't have the money to even feed their kids. Like, we have record long lines at food banks, and you're telling people, yeah, don't worry about that, get an EV. And I don't mean you specifically. I just mean in general. Like, that's all you see on the news is, you need an EV. You've got to buy solar panels. You got to buy this. You got to buy, carbon tax is going up. Gas is going to cost more.
Oh, no, I'm totally with you. And I mean, you haven't even mentioned how the price of food has skyrocketed. And we were talking earlier how insurance is going up.
Yeah.
And, you try to get a mortgage, but you have to have insurance. And so what if you can't even get a mortgage?
Yeah.
Can't even find a place to rent because, there's the whole thing with investors buying up properties and,
Yep.
yeah, don't even get us started, right? I mean, that's a whole other podcast.
So I'm sure people want to think about the environment and the future, but I mean, in the present, like, you're trying to figure out where you're going to live and how you're going to eat.
Exactly. So it's really interesting because the way you phrased it actually has the root issues in it. Let me explain.
No, I completely get that, but yeah, go ahead and explain.
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't think climate change should be at the top of anyone's priority list. In fact, the only reason I care about climate change is not because the average temperature of the planet is increasing. If that was the only thing that was happening, it would be a scientific curiosity.
Yeah.
I care about it because it literally is already affecting the cost of food. In fact, they have calculated that most of the inflation, not all, but most of the inflation that we've experienced globally over the last 2 or 3 years has been due to increases in the cost of fossil fuels, in large part due to the war on Ukraine.
Okay.
So they call it even fossilflation, is what economists are calling a lot of our inflation these days. So doubling down long term on the source of one of the primary sources of our inflation today, you can see is not going to be a good solution long term. So that's one of the issues, is that climate change is not a priority in and of itself, but it's the US military actually has a really interesting term. They call it a threat multiplier. So climate change is increasing the cost of insurance. It's increasing the vulnerability of our housing. It's putting more people's housing at risk, more of our infrastructure at risk. It's causing a much greater toll on the public budget. In Canada and in the US, our extreme weather disasters, the cost of those extreme weather disasters is just skyrocketing.
Yeah.
We don't have such a good public information as they do in the States, but in the States, they used to have one of these billion-dollar weather and climate disasters every 4 months in the 1980s. This last year, they had one every 1.8 weeks.
Wow.
That is a huge toll on the public budget in terms of disaster relief and recovery, and not just the federal budget, but often the city budget as well, and the provincial budget. So climate change is a threat multiplier. Whatever issues are at the top of the list, whether it's my kids' health, the price of food, where we're going to live, climate change is making all those worse. And so it's sort of like if we just put a Band-Aid on the problem now, but we don't address something that's making those problems worse, we're never going to fix them long term. That's a really important perspective to have.
Okay.
Now, also, it isn't about the environment over people. And actually, Stephen Harper was really good at sort of saying, it's the economy or it's the environment. So let's pick the economy. It's like, there is no economy on a dead planet.
Yeah, that's true.
When we look at the financial hit we are already taking due to climate change and how that's increasing every year, this is an economic issue. And then another very common misconception among people who are very worried about climate change is that climate action is more expensive than doing nothing. The reality is exactly the opposite. Doing nothing is rapidly becoming much more expensive than taking action. In fact, by 2050, if we invested in clean energy, we'd be saving $12 trillion at the global economic level over remaining, with our current energy mix. And the faster we do it, the more we save. And then in Canada, with our price on carbon that we have in Canada, what people don't realize is if you are middle or lower income, you're getting the money back.
Yeah.
You are getting it back. Despite what you hear in the news, if you are somebody who's struggling to pay for gas or pay for groceries, the carbon tax is not harming you financially long term. In fact, it's actually investing in additionally to giving you money back, investing in things that will make it easier for you to make the right choices, like
Okay,
bringing down
sorry.
the cost of EVs. So there's a
Sorry for
lot to
that.
unpack there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to
Yeah.
unpack there. The current leader of the Conservatives is saying the exact opposite because of the carbon tax from the person who makes the food, from the truck drivers, from the businesses, we're actually paying more in carbon tax than we're getting back. What was he saying? In Ontario, we're paying $2,800 in carbon taxes and we're getting $1,800 back.
So every
Like
economist,
if you look at
yeah,
the big picture, like not just gas and home heating.
mhm.
And then you get the people who are out in the middle of nowhere who don't get natural gas, who have to pay for oil, who are now paying exceptionally large amounts.
Mhm. I think that we need to, and this is something that Alberta actually did when they had a carbon price, because they had a carbon price quite early, before we had it at the federal level, really investing in not only the rebate programs and if you want to insulate your house, if you want to, take out the oil and put in something else, really investing in and communicating in addition, because you could have
Right.
great programs, but if people don't know about them, nobody does it. That's really important. And so if you look at the US has taken a bit of a different step. Now, carbon tax is really efficient economically. Economists are all on board, including conservative economists, politically conservative economists even, are on board with carbon pricing. But in the States, I think they've shown the power of small carrots too. So in the States, they have something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think is a really good name. Who doesn't want to reduce inflation, right?
Right.
But it's a series of carrots for example, investing in manufacturing opportunities in blue collar areas where employment's been going down and sending it back up again. There are all kinds of rebates for people to put in heat pumps, to electrify their homes, and heat pumps do work in Canada too,
Yeah.
to get EVs or to get solar panels or to do other climate friendly actions that ultimately do save you money. So ultimately they'll save you money, but there's an initial investment. So how do you help people get over the hump? Small carrots help. But in the States, the US government, they put all this in the bill. But I don't know about you, but I can't figure out federal bills for myself. Like if I had to figure out what to do in my house because of a federal bill, I'd be lost. And
I
I'm a
mean, that's
scientist.
Thomas's job, so we'll
Yeah.
ask him.
Okay.
Can
Well,
you
there you
figure
go.
out federal bills, Thomas?
Thomas could help. But what other organizations in the States have been doing is like there's one called Rewiring America that's all about how to electrify your home. Even I think the was it the Washington Post that had like a guide where you actually put in like how big is your house, what state do you live in, what does your budget look like, and it actually gives you an ABC. Here's what you can get in rebates, and here's it even crunches the numbers for you so you can figure it out for your budget. So I feel like that's a missing piece that we really need for people, because we shouldn't be asking people to out of their personal pockets, if they are low or middle income, we shouldn't be asking them to stump up to fix the problem in terms of hundreds of dollars. But we should be putting in financial mechanisms, which carbon pricing really can be that financial mechanism. And in many cases it is, we just don't know about it. Putting in that place where people can make the decisions and it does make financial sense. And I would venture, I haven't unpacked the conservatives' estimates, but I would put money on them not accounting for the avoided climate harms and the climate resilience.
Probably not. Just
Yeah,
like Justin Trudeau doesn't put in that the gas from the dryers and the trucks and so on and so forth go into what is taken off the rebate.
exactly.
But
And we
to
need
get
both. I agree. I think we
yeah,
need
oh
full
no.
accounting. Yeah.
I think to get sort of cyclical and go back to my original point, I think a lot of people want to invest in this. They see the carbon tax and they think if the federal government was saying, okay, you're going to get maybe half your rebate, we're taking the rest to solar panels in Alberta and battery backups so that we don't have to bring these natural gas plants online, people would be fine with that. The big problem that I
We
have
already had
is,
that we basically already had that in Ontario, Jared, the cap and
yeah,
trade program.
Mhm.
They
well,
would take the money from the
exactly. No,
businesses and then they would invest it in green related
yeah.
stuff. But anyway.
But I mean, you hear things too. Like I remember Kathleen Wynne did that with wind turbines, and they produced 10% of what they said they would.
Mm.
So people see articles like that and they get upset. But I mean, my point is like, I would love solar panels on my house. I consider myself middle class. I would love to put solar panels on my house. I got a quote on it, and yeah, I get money back from the federal government, provincial government, but initially I got to drop $40,000 to get it.
Right.
And I don't get to, that gets paid off after 20 years. And I'm making like that's what I paid for my Bolt, for my EV. And I don't want another car payment.
Exactly. So you're really putting your finger on what, in my opinion, we're missing. I really feel like, number one, we're missing clear communication.
Mm.
And when I say we, I mean all over the place. They're not doing it. They're not doing enough of it in the States. They're not doing enough of it in the EU. We're not doing enough of it in Canada. I'm not putting my finger on any one person. I'm just saying we're just taking communication for granted. And like you just said, we need articles on here's Joe and Nancy in Sarnia. Here's how much they make a year. Here's what their house looks like and how old it is. Here's the rebate programs they took advantage of. And then here's a missing piece. Here are the loan programs that go in and say, well, how much do you pay for hydro per month now? And we will give you a loan for the solar panels that is $100 less than your average hydro bill per month. And then it actually reduces your budget as well as making a difference. And I actually know somebody, one of my colleagues at the university, who got a loan like that from his local credit union. So we need the mechanisms, we need the information, and we need that clarity, because like you just said, most people want to do the right thing, but we just feel like we don't have the resources to do so. I mean, I don't have $40,000 to just drop on something.
Right.
Like, who has that in this economy? The people who already have enough to make sure they're okay, even if they don't have insurance. Sort of a recurring theme here. So we really need, there's this connecting of dots that is still not happening most places around the world, and we're no exception.
Yeah. So getting into the technology there, you mentioned solar as well. Is technology where it needs to be to sort of prevent this? This is the thing, is I always see when politicians get involved in climate change and things like that, a lot of what they're suggesting is going to bring us back to the Stone Age, and we got to get rid of this, we got to get rid of that, we got to get rid of. Humans evolved and got to where we are by technology, by using our minds, by adapting and finding solutions. Is our technology there, and can we bring our technology to a place where it can help us actually revert climate change? I mean, like in terms of carbon capture, Elon Musk and his battery technology is incredible. Like, I think he said if they took like a large swath of land in Arizona and put up solar panels, they could cover most of the state's electricity, but then you'd need battery backups. I know California finally did that after going for complete green energy and screwing the pooch the first year. But is technology in a good place to take care of that?
So many thoughts.
I sort of word vomit there. I get excited and I let it all out.
That's all good. A number of years ago, I started getting a lot of people say, well, we don't have enough room for all the wind and solar energy that we need. And people were saying this more in Canada, or in the US, because I think in Canada, we know we do have enough room.
Yeah. I've driven through Arizona and I can say that that's not true.
Exactly. So what I did was I calculated at that time, how much area we would have to cover in West Texas. I don't know if you've ever been to West Texas, but it is all just either ranch land or cotton fields, nothing else. And I calculated that if you covered about 100 by 100 square mile area with solar panels from 10 years ago, not even today, that in West Texas, which is like 4 cotton farms, they're very big out there, that would be enough to supply the entire United States with electricity. Wow. And I looked at a map of current land use, and it turns out that's about equivalent to the current area the United States uses to produce maple syrup and golf courses.
Wow.
And so I put that up on Twitter, and somebody pinged Elon Musk, and he responded, and he said, yes, my calculations agree.
Really?
Wow. Yes.
Wow.
So we are both on the same page there. And in fact, so I work at the Nature Conservancy, which is called Nature United in Canada. Very a bit confusing, but we have the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and then we have the Nature Conservancy globally that works in 80 countries as the Nature Conservancy, except Nature United in Canada. Anyways, all that to say, we've actually just finished a big report where they looked all across the US to figure out where you could put all the wind and solar. And it turns out we have so much wasteland beside highways, former mine sites, that if you just covered the wasteland, not even talking about roofs yet, just the wasteland, that gives us enough wind and solar space. So, and like you said, in Arizona, there's tons of space too. So in terms of batteries, what's really cool is, and this is part of why I like living in Texas, is Texas has like 5 or 6 battery technologies already online that they're testing.
Nice.
There's the traditional batteries, like batteries. But then there's also when wind energy goes negative. Sometimes they will pay you to take wind energy off the grid. That's how much wind energy there is in Texas.
Wow.
Over the weekends, we're up to 85% wind and solar energy on the grid now in Texas.
Nice.
Yeah. So anyways, there's when wind energy goes low or negative, they've got this set up with these giant concrete blocks that they raise. And then when it's expensive, they just drop them. And then they're also pumping water under high pressure into underground salt caverns. They've got 2 distributed power plants in Texas that are using people's wall batteries and solar panels to actually create a virtual power plant so that they can make money off it. I mean, the stuff that's going on is wild in terms of technology. So it isn't a case of going back to the Stone Age. It's a case of going into the next era. We are heading into the next era. We've been using fossil fuels since the 1300s. Is it not time to move on to the next source of energy? China agrees they've got more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world. And they're trying to sell their coal to other countries because they still want to sell the coal, but they don't want to burn it themselves. So we really are heading into a new world. And it's not about going backwards. It's about moving forwards.
It's funny you mention that because, I mean, I completely agree with you. But I did it on a smaller level in terms of EVs. Like when I got my electric vehicle, the thing's just brilliant. I love the idea of electric vehicles because the idea of containing an explosion in a little metal box seems so rudimentary and so old school. And then like the moving parts and everything to make this happen. And then you go to an EV and it's like, yeah, just turn on a battery and a motor spins. Like you do that on a global scale or even like a national scale. It is just genius to me. And it makes me wonder why, like, if something as small as a couple cotton fields in Texas is all you need to electrify the entire United States, why aren't governments doing this? I mean, our governments pour away so much money on just wasted crap that they could do this and then tout it as, hey, look, we're taking care of the environment. I mean, the Arrive Scam app that Trudeau just put through for $60 million, I'm sure you could take that money, buy a couple of farms in Alberta and have Canada electrified instead of taxing the crap out of people on a carbon tax.
So a lot of countries are doing this. And like I just mentioned, people, China has bad air pollution. China builds a lot of, burns a lot of coal. But China is also, last year, they put in more new solar last year than the US has built in its entire history.
Wow.
I mean, that's how fast it's changing. And in terms of EVs, I was just down in Florida, which is a very vulnerable state to climate change, of course, because it's very low lying, sea level rise. And whenever I travel, I always take an electric Uber because I figure why not, right? And so I was in this electric Uber with this guy for 45 minutes, and it was a Tesla. And the entire 45 minutes, he told me all about why he loved his car. And he did not once mention climate or carbon pollution or anything like that. It was all the other bells and whistles that he loved. He loved racing it. He loved the acceleration. He loved the sensors. He loved the fact that he was in beta mode. And so he could actually give lifetime feedback. I mean, this man went on and on and on about how much
no oil changes, little maintenance. If we had another 45 minutes, I would do another EV episode with you entirely, and I would not stop talking. Thomas can attest to that. Oh, God. We've already done one.
Yeah. So part of this, so here's what it is, Jared. What you're doing is you're telling people why this is so great. So instead of people being like, oh, no, gosh, I went to the dealership and they were just electric cars. Where am I going to find a normal car? Instead, they're like, oh, I heard from Jared how awesome these things are. Yeah. Oh, and now I've got a rebate, but I have to get a car anyway. It's not a matter of, having to get rid of a perfectly good car, but it's time for me to get a new car. Why don't I get this one? Because Jared told me how awesome it was. Oh, and plus there's a rebate. Oh, and plus it's good for climate change. Those should be the icing on the cakes, not the meat of why we're making the decision.
Right.
So, Katharine, one thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap this up, and you kind of alluded to it a bit earlier, was it kind of back to the communications thing. So I mentioned that governments respond to what their electorate is saying, what the citizens are saying. But with citizens, especially a lot of young people, I don't know if I can still consider myself young, but we go on TikTok And just hearing about how the environment's like, it's all going to end in 30 years. It's just kind of dark humor on some of these social media platforms. And then this kind of sense of despair sets in where you feel like you can't make a difference. Why even bother? Politicians don't care. X amount, this, blah, 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 blah. How do we communicate something more positive, something so, I guess, that could be dark, so a bit more positively, so that people want to kind of make a difference, and then maybe put some more pressure on their governments to act on it a little bit more urgently than maybe what's happening now?
Well, you've really hit the nail on the head, because most people in Canada and even in the US are worried about climate change. A poll in Texas just showed that 48% of registered Republican voters are either very worried or somewhat worried about climate change. So most people are worried, but we don't know what to do. And all the stories about what's happening are all about places far away from us, like ocean circulation or Antarctica.
Yeah.
So what do we have to do? We have to talk about what's happening where we live, to people, places, and things we love and care about. And then we need to talk about the solutions that are already happening. What is already happening in Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, Halifax, and all places around Canada and around the world? What can we do to make a difference? How can we use our voice to advocate for change where we live? It's not about our light bulbs. It's about using our voice to call for change. And so about a year ago, I started a newsletter. It is called Talking Climate, and you can find it online at talkingclimate.ca.
We'll put that in the show notes for you.
Perfect. Thank you. And what I do is every week now I share good news. This week it was about electric tugboats, because shipping actually produces a lot of carbon pollution. I share not so good news that's relevant to our lives. This week it was about bananas, and last week it was about coffee. And then I share what you can do. And this week is about these climate conversation cards one of my colleagues in Kentucky created, a woman named Kegel, and they take them to the farmer's market. And they just hold up a card and they say, hey, what's your answer to this question? And they get the conversation started with people. I mean,
cool.
That sounds small, but how does the world change? It begins with a conversation today. So that's what we did together today. And that's what everyone listening can do too. Start a conversation, not about the polar bears or the ice sheets, but about why it matters to us, our heart, and what's being done about it, the hands.
Awesome. All right. That was really informative and a lot of fun, Katharine. Thank you for joining us on the Good Roads podcast. We're going to wrap everything up from there. Actually, you know what? 5 minutes. If you have anything to tell our viewers before you come to the conference in April, go.
Okay. We often think of climate change as an issue that matters to scientists and environmentalists, or maybe people in the government. But after the last year we just had in 2023, with record-breaking climate and weather disasters around the world, including the wildfire season we had in Canada, we know that it's no longer a future issue. It's here and now. And it's affecting us. It's affecting the air we breathe, the water we drink. It's affecting the economy, the safety of our homes, the price of food and energy. To care about climate change, we only have to be one thing, and that's a human being living on this planet. But the good news is there are solutions. There are solutions, and we can start today cutting our carbon pollution, preparing for the impacts of climate change, and helping others adapt and prepare as well. We can't do it alone, but I know we can do it together.
Beautiful. That's a great way to wrap up the episode, Katharine. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, when you, come to the Good Roads conference in April, check out Katharine on the main stage. If you're not signed up for the conference, definitely do yourself a favor, sign up for that. Because of the conference next month, the Good Roads podcast, we're going to be taking a break, but we'll be back in May. If you're watching this on YouTube, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. There are about 70% of you who watch this who are not subscribed. I would like to see that number go down, subscriptions go up. So give us a hand. Also leave a comment. We love your feedback. If you have any questions for Katharine, send them along. We'll pass them on to her, and maybe she'll answer them at the conference. And if you're there, you can hear it. Once again, like Katharine said, you just have to be a person on this earth to care about climate change. So until the next episode, everybody, take it easy.